Welcome to Voice Note Me, a lo-fi podcast sharing beauty, one human at a time, your conversations unfolding in solitude, in other words, through voice notes. I'm Robin Bethel, a writer, a lover of voice notes, and your host. Thanks for joining me.
Rainy days don't seem so wet. Stormy nights don't stay.
For this first episode, I got to speak with Jacob Nordby, who's a writer, creative guide, and entrepreneur. He's the author of 3 books, The Creative Cure, Blessed Are the Weird, and also The Divine Arsonist, an autobiographical novel, and as I understand it, an origin story of sorts for the spiritual journey that he's embarked on. He's also the co-founder of A Writing Room with Anne Lamott, a place that offers teaching, community, and inspiration for writers. I also now know he is a lovely and deep soul. I decree it. I didn't know Jacob well at all before this conversation. I had run into him once in a coffee shop and knew of him from social media, so this gave me a chance to see much more into who he is, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. I want to start off just asking you something pretty simple. I know you're the author of The Creative Cure and Blessed Are the Weird and The Divine Arsonist. I know you're a Sagittarius rising. So am I, so I kind of have some nearness in that. So really, this is about where I stand with what I know. And so can you just tell me a little bit who you are in any way that feels meaningful to you? I want you to answer it however you want to, but I would be interested to hear, who have you been and who are you now?
Oh, wow. You ask such a big question starting right off the bat. Who are you? I love that question. I went and saw my friend April Crowell. You may know her. She's an Asian medical practitioner here in Boise and has done so for, 25 or 30 years, I think. So she has a lot of knowledge and does some great work. And years ago, I first met her and had her work on me, and I was struggling with my energy and had some depressive stuff going on and just feeling very much out of sorts. And she laid me on her massage table and started, doing her work, checking pulses and meridians and all those things, and said, I feel like you need to ask and answer the 3 big soul questions. Who am I? Why am I here? And how shall I live? And I started laughing right out loud because the pursuit of those questions had occupied, the last almost decade of my life following The Divine Arsonist, that experience that became a book eventually. And as you said, was the kind of the origin story of breaking out of this externally focused way of living and comparison. Back then, prior to all that, I was an entrepreneur, and everyone around me thought that I was just on my way to massive success. You're a rising star, they would all say. And I was waking up at 3 a.m. almost every morning, terrified, feeling like an imposter, not able to even let the fruits of my work sink in as satisfying, And the truth is, I was not in alignment with my soul self at that point. And so anyway, talking with April years and years later, and she asked me to go back home and do some work on those questions. And I told her, I've been doing this for so many years. And she said, yeah, I think this is more practical. I'd love for you to let yourself come current. Who are you now? She's like, be very concrete about it. I'm a something aged man living in Boise. I have children, and so I started doing that. And the same with, why am I here right now? She's like, these don't have to be these massive philosophical, existential questions at 30,000 feet or above. This is where you touch the ground right now. And how have you changed? Who are you now in your becoming, And that has been so useful. And I recently started redoing that. It's been 7 or 8 years, I think, since I met with April on that. And I've continued to be asking those questions the whole time. But, as I move into this phase of my life, my children are grown, and my engagement with how I serve, how I live, how I work, that is also changing. And so I love, I think Alan Watts once said, trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth. And I suspect for folks with strong Sagittarius influence, that's even more true. We tend to have so many interests and passions and vocations and avocations and all of that. But one thing I know for who I am now, Robin, is I wouldn't say I'm a seeker, although at times I find myself in a search for an answer, for a solution to the maze, the labyrinth I'm in at the moment. But in general, I find myself more able to be with this guy. So I'm not specifically a writer, I write. That's one of the things I do. It's one of the expressions of myself, of my service, and of my joy, Sometimes writing doesn't feel joyful, as you know. But I find myself called right now, at this point in my life, to really answer those questions again, practically. Let the photograph come up to date, whatever the snapshot was before, it's different now. And so I feel grateful for that opportunity. And, it's really led to my growing sense of this cyclical sort of spiralic pattern of self-discovery and then self-acceptance and self-expressions. And of course, these are not steps 1, 2, 3. They tend to go in circles. It's more of a Venn diagram is what I've found for myself, that I go in these circular patterns of more self-discovery. Okay, who am I more now? And then the more that I learn about myself, the more that naturally brings me into self-acceptance. Carl Jung once said, accepting oneself completely is the most terrifying thing. So I feel like it has to be titrated for most of us, over time, in this discovery and then this acceptance. And as I see it, expressing from who we really are more and more and more, that becomes as natural as breathing. So when I work with people and with myself, I really seek to start with the fountainhead. Who am I? And then be with the parts that feel resistant to those answers, the parts that don't want to accept, this is who I am. This is more of who I am, And so for me, that becomes this ongoing process. It's a practice, self-discovery, self-acceptance, and self-expression. For me, the main miss that a lot of people experience with trying to attain enlightenment or some version of that is it's this thing out on the horizon. So they're always thinking about it. And it's always somewhere out there. Someone that they follow, some guru or some model of some kind is always way out ahead. And I'm not there yet, which means I'm not enough, which means I'm not worthy. And so I really seek to come all the way into this present moment and go, I am, and I am enough, and I am worthy right now. And the process of becoming is this tremendous practice. And the more that I'm willing to do it, the more I find that I have the resilience and the resourcefulness to continue to re-engage with life, sometimes even when that feels very difficult or depressing. But there's this deep curiosity of this inner learning creature, this soul self that as Mary Oliver would say, there's a great beast inside you shouting, "This life is exactly what I came for." I'm pretty sure I paraphrased that a bit, but there is this sense of I'm here, and I'm in the process of discovering. It's like an archaeology dig. I'm discovering the bones, the structure. This is who I am, and then I also begin to have more clarity on how to express that self in the world, and in life. So I think I'll leave it there because it feels like this has gone on quite a while. But thank you for the question and the opportunity to sit with these things with you.
When I listened back to my first message, I used the word simple at least once and maybe twice to describe that initial question. And really that was the wrong word because it isn't quite simple at all. But it feels more kind of like foundational, and I feel like with your answer, you gave me a really lovely foundation to begin with. I can tell that you've been with this question a lot, as you said. And it's interesting if I'm doing the math kind of right. It sounds like this, big shift in journey of moving from a more externally focused way of living into something different. Sounds like it was maybe about 17 years ago, give or take a little bit. And I have to say, I wonder, are you familiar with the Pluto transit through Capricorn? If you're not, I feel like you should look into that because it began in 2008 and it really just finished up. And for you, it would have been in your second house. Pluto is moving through your second house of resources and livelihood and, bringing a slow simmering transformation in that space. So it sounds like when this shift in how you would be in the world may have began kind of around that place-ish, at least. But thank you for sharing that. I would say what I most want to ask you next is, one thing I was thinking on was, what prompted this opening into a new, less externally focused life? Such a huge transformation and beginning of another journey. And then instead of asking that though, because I feel like that you've shared that in my understanding through your novel, your autobiographical novel. And instead of going into that direction, it instead makes me want to ask something that feels tangled up in that area, perhaps, but in a different way and not centered on that one experience. So, but I feel interested in, some of these textures of self, in the continued grappling, the continued cycle of self-discovery and self-acceptance and self-expression. And so to draw some of those out more, I'd love to hear about your relationship to alchemy and your relationship to death and your relationship to comfort.
Relationship with alchemy. Wow. It's an interesting question. Along the path of self-discovery, I've come to see that the soul leaves clues, and I call them like breadcrumbs, like Hansel and Gretel. So when I work with people who are struggling to find their purpose, I often go, what were you interested in as a very young person? What caught your attention? And how was that expressed, or did you drop any clues along the way that says, yes, I'm still interested in that? So alchemy, I would say, would be one of those topics. And really anything in that realm, I found myself fascinated by how humans train each other to stay inside of extremely small limitations, in life. And so I was raised, as you probably know, very fundamentalist Christian. And I used to ask my father, who was a Greek and a Hebrew scholar, just kind of an intimidating intellect, really. I would ask him questions about things, that just it seemed out of place, or it seemed like we weren't paying attention to them. For example, when Jesus Christ was said to have said, "Greater works than these shall you do," I was fascinated. I'm like, I want to know about that, and I was fascinated by anything mind over matter. And in the framework I was raised in, there wasn't room for that, in fact, I was forbidden, but I would still find myself sometimes going to corners of the library and sitting there behind the stack reading books that probably wouldn't have been okay at my home. So that takes you back a long way. And really, human potential is part of that. And of course, and not just what we can physically accomplish, but what we can accomplish in our spirit, in our expansion, finding out who we really are outside of our fears and other beliefs that limit us. And so when I had that big experience, and yes, your math is correct, it's been about 17 years, 2007, 2008, I had already left the church that I grew up in, had been out for a long time and hadn't really developed a connection, really, I was reading Wayne Dyer and Deepak Chopra and Marianne Williamson, and those thinkers really opened my heart and my mind to different ways of being, like, oh, it's possible to actually be at peace with the divine in some way, all of that. And later on, I began to really get into Carl Jung and his works and the people who, surround him as teachers of his work. Alchemy was a present idea all the time. And so for me, alchemy is the transformation of one form into a finer form, the gross form, the ore, and then as it goes through the process of going through crucibles and other forms of refinement, sifting and sorting, we find the gold in all of that, And I could spend a long time here, but I just really love and have always loved that slow, patient, sometimes mysterious and difficult to see a linear path through, but it's this process of becoming, I know I'm not saying anything new to you there, but that my relationship with it has been very, definitely influenced and colored by Jung's work and his perspectives on that, but then also not just reading about it, experiencing it in my life and watching how difficult experiences often activate the sequence, and that says, okay, here we go. We're going to go find the gold in this situation. So even going through periods of real depression or other hardship, there was always this little glimmer, like, oh, there is something here for me. And I chose this path. I chose this circumstance to be part of in some way. So let me find out what that means. And let me see if going through this and trying to keep my eyes and heart open as I go through it, let me see if this can yield greater insight into the rest of my life, and let's see if it can actually hold up a mirror so I can, in an oblique fashion, glance and see my shadow, which is so difficult to do. And I've experienced that over and over again, including this year. This year, 2024, was a real crucible for me in so many ways. And I feel like this year in particular really got me to the heart of a really old limiting belief that said, I don't matter. Above that would be a belief that says I'm not enough. And then, we go into all the other, I'm not lovable, I'm not safe, I'm not, all those things. I'll be rejected. But at the core of that for me is this thing of I don't matter. And coming into awareness that part of the shadow was really operating in so many areas of my life, And I always shrunk from the idea of saying I matter in an ego sense. Even as a child, I was really afraid or really reluctant to step forward in that way. And so people often viewed this as a lack of confidence, and in many ways it was, but I never wanted to claim a thing that I hadn't fully known and experienced, or at least experienced and known enough to say some version of this is mine now because I've been through it. It's not something I just read about or thought about. So I would say if you want to ask more about alchemy, that would be great. But also, when you asked about relationship to death, I think these things are connected, because that process of moving beyond, moving through an old paradigm, an old structure of beliefs, whatever it might be. And in this case, I'm certainly not speaking of just my original religious beliefs. That was one framework, but all the other frames, near that, or that were affected by that. And so it's interesting. I had this tremendous shamanic experience in 2007 that broke everything open. And during that, it was, they were administering DMT. I thought I was going to a meditation retreat, and it turned out to be a shamanic initiation. And that was my first time of experiencing myself dissolve completely into the all, capital A, all. And at sort of the top of that journey, it was so explosive and expansive. St. John's words rang in my consciousness: there is no fear in love, and perfect love casts out fear. And it was the first time in my life that I had experienced a split second of having no fear and being absorbed by the divine, the universe, God, whatever we want to call it, and having no more me left just for a split second, and being perfectly at peace. And as I came back down into my body and into normal awareness after a while, I realized, and in years later, as I researched what I had been through, I learned that was a chemically induced near-death experience, essentially. And so it really altered my sense of what death is. And I would love to say that crystal powerful awareness has always stayed with me. I would say that, the process of alchemy means a lot of deaths, death of one illusion after another. And each death is there's uncertainty there, Leave one form, leave one belief, leave one way of being behind, and stepping into the new means we can't know exactly what will come up. And that, so I would love to say that I have no fear of death. I would say I probably don't dread it, but I would be lying if I said I don't ever fear it or feel anxiety about it. But my relationship to it, I feel, is different in that I do see it as a doorway and its own form of alchemy, in the soul's journey. What's my relationship to comfort? I would say that I'm going through a pretty big transformation of that. If you've heard of or studied at all cortisol addiction, I've done so much work with anxiety in my life and have found a lot more peace in general. So the set point doesn't feel like it's constantly anxious. I will say, though, that this year I've had a chance to have a couple of months really off, and I felt called to let them be downtime this time, rather than jumping out and saying, okay, I have to fill this with meaningful, productive, purposeful, all that, because folks with cortisol addiction tend to not be able to sit still very long. And I would say that's, that would characterize me in some way. It has, I should say. And so this time has been one where I've been called to be quiet and to experience depression and the discomfort of comfort. That strange paradox of, I don't know that I have earned the right to be comfortable right now. And learning that's an old voice. So really putting all that to inquiry and asking, is this true? Is it true that I need to be doing more right now? And if the answer is no, then sometimes the most revolutionary thing to do is simply sit down and be quiet and rest. So I would say that's where I've been updating, revising my relationship with comfort. And I would love to say it's completely resolved and comfortable, but I would say I'm making progress, and that feels good, you know. All right, well, I'm enjoying these questions. Normally, when I'm on a podcast, I will seek to make it a reciprocal conversation, at least part of the time, even though I know that, you know, I'm being interviewed. But I do like to share the floor. And so if you would like to respond to any of these things or share your experiences of them, you know, along with your next questions, just know that I would welcome that.
I think I will touch on a few of those things, but really lightly, or at least lightly for me, because they're really large questions, and at least the first two feel really close to my heart and soul. And I don't want to take up as much space as really letting myself fall into those would entail. So, but yeah, I also love the idea of alchemy, and I found myself, about probably 7 years ago, very soon after 7 years ago, coming into a space in life where I, would have a lot of sadness over certain things. But I have to say, I've never, not in the sense of a depression or even generally a melancholy, but just sadness over loss in various waves, here and there and here and there, and this place and this. And but it's something that I'm very comfortable with, and I really let myself feel everything that I feel really intensely and really deeply. Kind of a really intricate, soft, or violent, or soft and violent sometimes a way. And so I felt the language that came to me around that probably about 7 years ago, as I would feel all of these storms moving through me, and just really being with those feelings so closely, and then, being with the next feelings. And it felt very much like this alchemy, letting everything layer inside of me be. I guess that would be what happens first, right? Let everything be, feel it. And then it felt like it would kind of sift down and layer inside of me as beauty. And it felt like a texturizing of the soul. And that phrase, I feel I am totally tossing this out there, and it may not be right at all, but maybe Hermann Hesse said something about sorrow as this texturizing of soul. Or maybe I made it up. I don't know, but I have that phrase in my head. And then I know there's something from, what is his name? Francis Weller, about sorrow and sadness as an apprenticeship of soul, in a way. I might have jumbled that a little bit, something along those lines. And I would say, especially the summer of 2019 began what felt like a little bit more like an apprenticeship in sorrow, just with this one thing that stayed with me over time, not really in a moving through the day way, but just something that, at night, being with that, it would, be with me for quite a while. And So it was a different type of sorrow and sadness, but it felt like so beautiful in that. I just feel like all of these different experiences and just being so closely with these different textures of emotion and life do really layer in, and it feels like they turn to beauty, so that's how I love alchemy in that sense. It feels like really just holding so tenderly, like what is meeting me or meeting us, and like really allowing it and fully opening into it. And then it finds its form in this shape inside us, and it just really feels like beauty. So I also love that phrase, alchemy. And yeah, like you said, death really winds up in that, right? Like so many of the things for me, I feel like really, I have to say, I don't naturally have a lot of anxiety. It's not really very near the shape of my soul in so many ways, yet I've had 2 experiences of intense anxiety in a concentrated period of time. But aside from that, it's not really with me. I feel like out of the so-called like negative emotions, people would say, I don't really think of it that way per se, but it's really like my spirit veers into, feeling sadness with things, and it's usually then tied to loss, right? Which is the same as, they're just deaths. So, but I feel really near death. And in 2020, I had a brief flurry of kind of opening into my own death and possibly dying in 6 months from something that was not true. But I, for a weekend, really opened into it, and it was a pretty profound experience. But yeah, I feel like after that, before, I definitely, was very near allowing myself to be present and feel and just meet everything meeting me, right? And the alchemy of that, everything layering in as beauty. But I hadn't really concretely opened into death per se. So that was something that met me a little more specifically. Then I would also just say kind of a year after that, I opened into the possibility of civilizational death in kind of a similar way. I'm going to skate across that too. But I do feel like this sense of death and rebirth feels pretty near me. And I feel familiar with it. Of course, like all the small deaths and things. And I trust in the divine and the universe a lot, and just kind of open into what is unfolding imperfectly, but also pretty thoroughly. And then on comfort, I feel, if I'm thinking of comfort as like, in a way, if we're thinking of it with like life and discomfort, and I'm really, really comfortable with discomfort, kind of being in these like trust falls and different things like that. But if we're looking at, so like I can hold comfort really lightly in that way. If we look at it though from a perspective that's a little different from all these big things, but like the cozy, I don't know if I want to actually say what I was about to just say. My emphasis, I was going to give great emphasis to how much I love the cozy, but I love the cozy so much. So I'm sitting in my living room next to our Christmas tree, which has been up since a few days before Halloween, I think, which was my son's choice, and I rolled with it. And I have a candle lit. I love candlelight. I love warm glow. I love ice cream. I love twinkle lights. So I love the cozy. I love comfort in that way. And then in terms of, the comfort, discomfort of being in unfamiliar territory or ground, I'm quite comfortable without the comfort. So, okay, that was a bit more than I meant to say, but what I'd like to say in response to what you were talking about is, I just want to say that I feel a little bit struck by the depth of your openness, and I feel that's something that I've often heard, and it is lovely to see that, to hear that and feel it in you, and it brings me to what I want to ask you next, which, based on your last response, and who you were reading, Marianne Williamson, and things like this, and you're touching on the divine, I see that depth of openness as a beautiful piece of you and your soul. And so what I'd like to ask you is, there's been a little more touching on those notes of like what you need to accept, right? Those spaces. So I kind of want to look at it from a different place that may or may not be comfortable for you to answer. I don't know if I want to ask this in the more elaborate way or a simpler way. I'm going to go simpler. I would love for you to share what textures of the divine, what textures of divine masculine and or divine feminine, or what textures of beauty do you feel you hold in your soul? Please and thank you.
Before I dive right into answering your most recent question about the textures of divine feminine and masculine, I wanted to add this bit about sorrow from Khalil Gibran that has helped me down through my life since I first read it. And he writes, "Your joy is your sorrow unmasked, and the self-same well from which your laughter rises was oftentimes filled with your tears. And how else can it be? The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain." And joy, for me, is such a interesting term, because I feel like maybe I've already touched on this, but joy to me is this deep aquifer beneath the surface of life, and it's there even when we are going through what on the surface feels like a desert, or a desolate place, or the valley of the shadow of death, or any of these things. To me, joy is that really deep, still and moving, paradoxically, but very deep, and it's always there to sustain us. And perhaps especially when we have to dig for it, we have to be more conscious of it or invite its awareness into our experience, when we're going through those times that feel so difficult, to be reminded, to hear that little bell way back there in the psyche saying, hey, look for it, look for the joy, look for the avid curiosity that your soul self has about being in this circumstance, So I feel like in some ways your question about what characteristics of masculine and feminine do I carry, it's a challenging question, looking at it from inside the house that is me through these windows. It's maybe a little more difficult to see since it's what I'm in all the time. But, since I was a small child, I was always more noticeably sensitive than some around me. And while I would run around the woods and make shelters and, do all that kind of thing, I also was deeply involved engrossed with, literature, music, poetry, things like that. And, I didn't ever go to a public school, so I wasn't bullied in the way that many are, but I still experienced, that sense of being very different from many of those around me, boys, let's say. And my mother was really good about being able to hold the space around me for my emotional self. And so I more frequently cried and still do more frequently than a lot of people around me. And that's not always comfortable for me. Sometimes it's really inconvenient. But I've grown more comfortable in understanding that having those inner parts be unfrozen enough to be able to flow sustains me, and it carries me from one thing to the next. And I feel that it helps me move more fluidly. And I would say more fluidly, not fluidly all of the time, but more fluidly between things, and a little less apt to get stuck. So, that fluidity I feel like is likely a divine feminine attribute, aspect. I would say too that, like many men of my generation, Gen X and before, and of course men since then too, but there's been a lot more acceptance of a wider range of experience inside of different identifications. I identify as a man, therefore this is the range of emotion and expression that I feel okay with. In the men's group that I returned to at intervals, but sat through quite a few cycles for several years, especially as I was seeking to find a way to bring the gap together. It felt as though I didn't have much access to what we would consider to be, more masculine traits. While I could accomplish things and cast a vision and, be, I was going to use the word aggressive, but let's just say focused and determined in getting to those things. I also have had more of a willingness to back away from things that no longer felt right, and at times I would question that, like, is this just a lack of willpower? What is this, And Robert Bly, in his amazing book, Iron John, and all the work that he did, dovetailed into this period of my life where I was sitting in a lot of these men's group cycles, and finding myself able to be in the company of other men, especially in that environment where we were inviting ourselves and each other into laying down our armor and being there together and being seen and being appreciated, and also laying down the shields of sarcasm. And look, I'm part of a big family, and we think we are very funny, and I think we probably empirically are funny. But we also, there's often a lot of sarcasm, but it's over the years, it has gone away from being the kind of mean sarcasm, and it's more of a relishing of quick humor and irony is probably a good way to put it. But inside of these spaces where we're inviting ourselves to genuinely lean into a sense of safety, even if it's not comfortable, and allow ourselves to experience that as safe and go, okay, I'm going to take a risk here by showing and by feeling first, by feeling and then showing more of these emotions, I feel like there's this, that word atonement, and some will say it at one-ment. It's the bringing together of these things. I feel like I was given an opportunity in these environments, these men's groups, and, my own study and practice, really seeking to come into a better sense of comfort in myself and with who I am in the world. That began to close the gap between what I perceived as my deficiencies as a masculine human, and become more comfortable with the fact that, yes, I had been lopsided for a lot of my life. One counselor asked me, when did your mother tell you not to be like your father? And I had an immediate memory of that, and it wasn't just once, but I went to a moment when that happened. And when I no doubt began to really internalize that, and my father had many admirable masculine traits, and he also had a lot that just were keeping him stuck, the immature or the unhealed masculine parts. And so I know that parts of my personality formed early in life with that being, those things are off limits to me, And so this process then of really seeking to heal that, so it wasn't this gap, even maybe just a perceptual gap, but I could feel that there needed to be a coming together so that I didn't feel as if I were living in bits and pieces in these two poles, So over the years since then, I feel that I've grown more comfortable, and I feel also that that's a product of the environment that we're in, where much more is coming forward. People are becoming much more open about the need for healing from trauma and for therapy and for self-expression, and the hard boundaries around this is what a man is and this is what a woman is. Those things, have been dissolved quite a bit. And I feel like that's a really important and beautiful experience that we're having. And it's also deeply confusing because those binary identifications, have been present for so long, and they are comfortable for a lot of people. And anything outside of that, anything that would threaten it or suggest that perhaps the spectrum of each can be much wider than we generally give it room for, that can bring up a lot of uncertainty and anxiety, I think. And so, you get a man like me who is more sensitive and, enjoys, the more sensitive right brain kinds of things, but is also a man, and sexually, I'm not homosexual or bisexual or anything like that. And I know it's been confusing for some who kind of assume that I must be something other than a, cis hetero kind of a guy. So that's been an interesting thing to hold, and to be willing to just be, probably one of the reasons I wrote Blessed Are the Weird is, really seeking to say, hey, there's so much more to each of us. We all contain multitudes. It's not just for a few creative types or those who have more naturally wired to experience and express ourselves, in various ways. So I feel like we're being invited in this time on Earth out of many structures that have grown too rigid. And I want to just acknowledge the discomfort of that for our culture, and those of us who are really quite open to those developments can find ourselves impatient, I think, with people who resist it. And it doesn't make sense to us. Like, why would you resist this? It's an exploration and eventual expression of more of who we are, more of our divinity, more of ourselves, our essential selves. So why would we resist that? The conflict is many people are really just so uncomfortable with lacks of definitions. And so they're like, I need you to pick a side. I need you to pick a way of being. That way I can understand you. And it, underneath all of that is this longing for certainty. And because we have so many things, so many of the four pillars or the many pillars of life being shaken, some of them seem to be being destroyed. People, I feel like, get really reactive in this time right now and want people to pick a side, to pick a way of being, because it's like, I can't handle one bit more uncertainty. It's just too scary and painful, And so I feel like that is one of the greatest invitations we can give ourselves in this time on Earth, in this point in history, is to be curious, to be flexible, and to remember that I can only truly affect what's within my own arm's reach. And let's start with myself. How am I being with myself? How am I being curious and accepting? Where am I resisting? Where my true self wants to go? These kinds of questions. And I think I will wrap up there for now.
Just touching on what you said, along with just letting it breathe out there in its own form and beauty. I'm so with you on the sorrow. I feel like I personally love crying. I mean, I have no avoidance of it at all. And I cried, in like real fashion maybe a few days ago, and I realized I was so struck by the sense it had kind of been a while, which for me was maybe a few weeks or something like that. And I realized it had been a few weeks or maybe a month since I had kind of cried in that certain way. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's unusual. So, maybe in part we all have these different compositions of self and, emotional self and all of that and how we feel everything. But it does feel like when you just do feel really deeply and maybe you do feel that sorrow, different things like that easily. Maybe that joy as well comes more easily. So much beauty and so much to say on sadness and sorrow. And just, like that tenderizing the heart. But so thank you for bringing in those other thoughts. And on the rest, thank you also for sharing so freely about all of those expressions that you feel inside of yourself and have come into honoring and in this place in time where we are learning to see things and feel into them so differently. And I feel like all these textures of divine, masculine, consciousness, emptiness, divine feminine, that flow and the waves, the love, they're all the deepest reality, and we all hold these different compositions that touch into both, that reflect both, that are pieces of the divine all in this form, and it all belongs so perfectly. So thank you again, and I'm going to bring in one more question that might lead us into one more question, and it is, to almost close us out, would you like an earnest question, an absurd question, or a poem? Okay, you texted me that you wanted a poem, so, and that you would read it if I wanted, which I do. So I'm going to send it to you, and then I would love for you to read it for us. It's by Rainier Maria Rilke, who's one of my favorite poets, and it's from the Book of Hours, translated by Anita Barrows and Joanna Macy. And in a way, it feels a little bit random, at least coming off what we were just talking about, but it's something that came to mind earlier in our conversation, and I had the thought that I would like you to read it for us. So, random or not, here is a beautiful poem by a beautiful poet, read by a beautiful soul. I'm just going to say it, and thank you so much.
I'm so fond of Rilke's Book of Hours. I have it sitting here on my desk right now. So your selection here is really beautiful. Here's the poem. The hour is striking so close above me, so clear and sharp, that all my senses ring with it. I feel it now. There's a power in me to grasp and give shape to my world. I know that nothing has ever been real without my beholding it. All becoming has needed me. My looking ripens things, and they come toward me to meet and be met. Thank you, Robin.
Thank you for that, Jacob. And thank you for all of this. It's been really fun, and I feel you are the perfect conversation partner to jump into this new experiment with. So much thanks, and sending you so much goodness and continued beauty in the continued becoming. Thank you. If you want to learn more about Jacob on a different level, you can visit his website, jacobnordby.com. And if you want to learn more about the writing community he co-founded with Anne Lamott, you can visit awritingroom.com. And those will be in the show notes. Thanks for joining me on this first episode. And if you liked it, I hope you come back and open into more beauty that you may not have known before in the form of another human soul. I hope you have a great day. Bye.
Oh, this could be the best thing that I'll ever know.